"Mr. Kettridge has collapsed at the keyboard," the porter said, and I nearly dropped my sherry. It was 4:30 on Christmas Eve, the year 1900, and the lobby of the Aldwyn Grand had been humming with the particular contentment of a hotel that expects to be beautiful that night and knows it. Within the hour, that contentment had curdled into something closer to panic, because Mr. Kettridge, the hotel's aging organist-pianist, had been carried to his room white as tablecloth linen, and there was to be no music. I had wintered at the Aldwyn Grand for 11 years running, ever since my knees decided that army life and English fog no longer agreed, and I flatter myself that in 11 years a man learns the currents of a great house better than its own manager does. I knew, for instance, that Mrs. Radcliffe, the head housekeeper, ran that hotel's below-stairs world with a ledger's precision and a general's nerve, and that nothing frightened her so much as the prospect of the Aldwyn Grand, looking, even for one evening, ordinary. "There will be no music at dinner," she was saying to Mr. Halloway, the manager, in the corridor outside the drawing room, her voice pitched low but carrying the way trained voices do. "No music, and worse, no music for the carols before midnight mass. 50 guests expecting O Holy Night at the tree. And I have a organist laid out with a fever and a piano. Nobody in this house can touch." "Nobody at all, Mrs. Radcliffe," I ventured, for I had come up behind them, under the pretense of admiring the garland on the banister. She turned to me with the weary patience she reserved for elderly guests who asked too many questions. "Colonel Wingate, the girls who clean these rooms did not come here to play concertos." It was at that moment that Prudence Oakley came around the corner with an armful of pressed table linen, and stopped dead, because she had heard every word. I ought to describe her as I first properly saw her that evening, though of course I had passed her 100 times in the corridors without truly looking, the way one passes furniture. She was 22, small and quick, with a plain gray uniform dress and an apron gone soft gray-white from washing, and hands reddened from hot water and lye soap. Her father, I would learn before the night was through, had been the organist of a village church in Kent, a modest man who had died 3 winters past, and left his daughter nothing but a hymn book, a set of worn gloves, and more knowledge of the keyboard than anyone in that hotel would have credited a linen maid with possessing. "Begging your pardon, ma'am," Prudence said, and her voice did not shake nearly as much as I expected a maid's voice to shake when addressing her superior on a matter so far outside her station. "I can play it, O Holy Night. I've played it every Christmas Eve since I was 9. The corridor went very quiet. Somewhere below us a kitchen door swung and released a gust of goose fat and cloves, and above us the chandelier in the drawing room threw a wash of gaslight down the stairs, and Mrs. Radcliffe looked at this small maid holding an armful of linen, as though she had announced she could fly. "You," Mrs. Radcliffe said, not unkindly. I want to be exact about this, because it would be easy for me to make her a villain, and she was not one, only a woman with a household to run, and a lifetime's habit of sorting people neatly into their proper drawers, upstairs and downstairs, guest and servant, and never the twain crossing. "You clean the linen rooms, Prudence. You have never so much as dusted that piano." "My father taught me, ma'am, before he passed." "Your father was a village organist, I understand. God rest him. That is not the same as playing for 50 guests of the Aldwyn Grand on Christmas Eve." Mrs. Radcliffe's mouth had gone thin, but there was something else moving behind her eyes, too. Not cruelty, I think, so much as the particular fright of a woman who has spent her whole career making certain nothing in her hotel is ever allowed to go wrong, faced now with a wrongness she could not mend by scolding a housemaid into working faster. "I will not have this house embarrassed." "Then let her try," I heard myself say, and I confess it surprised me as much as anyone, for I am not a man given to intruding on the affairs of hotel staff. But I had watched Prudence Oakley's chin lift half an inch when she spoke of her father, and something in an old soldier recognizes that particular lift for what it is. Not bravado, but readiness. Mr. Halloway, who had been wringing his hands through this entire exchange, like a man watching his Christmas Eve dinner burn on the spit, seized on the suggestion, the way a drowning man seizes a rope. "An excellent notion, Colonel. Mrs. Radcliffe, what have we to lose?" "The alternative is silence." Mrs. Radcliffe drew herself up, and I watched her make the calculation every proud, careful person makes when cornered by circumstance. Better a small embarrassment attempted and survived than a large embarrassment simply endured. "Very well," she said, and turned to Prudence with a look that was not quite a dare, and not quite permission, but something colder and more exacting than either. "You will play for the guests before Mass, in the drawing room, at 11 o'clock. If you cannot do it, if you falter, if you shame this house in front of 50 guests, you will understand, Prudence, that I did try to spare you this." "I understand, ma'am," Prudence said, and dropped a small curtsy, and went on down the corridor with her linen, as though nothing at all had happened, though I noticed her hand trembled just slightly against the folded cloth. It was, I thought, watching her go, a very great deal to ask of a girl who scrubbed floors for her supper. I did not yet know how great a thing she carried inside her to answer it. The hours between 4 and 11 passed the way hours do in a great house on Christmas Eve, in a blur of holly and candle smoke, and carriages arriving, gentlemen in tails and ladies in silk, and fur stamping snow from their boots in the entrance hall. The enormous fir tree in the drawing-room corner glittering with 200 small candles that the under-footman tended all evening, with long snuffing poles, ready at an instant against fire. I dined that evening at the Colonel's usual small table by the window, but I confess I ate little and watched the clock a great deal, and more than once I caught sight of Mrs. Radcliffe moving through the room with her chin high and her hands clasped, wearing the face of a woman who has already composed, in her mind, the apology she will owe her guests. At 10:30, word went round below stairs, for word always goes round below stairs faster than anywhere in a hotel, that Prudence Oakley had not eaten her supper, had gone instead to sit alone in the cold, unused music room off the east corridor, the one with the old upright piano nobody used for anything but tuning practice, and had played there, softly, for nearly an hour, the same 16 bars over and over. I did not hear this at the time. I only saw her, at 11:15, come down the servants' stair into the drawing-room corridor in her one good dress, dark blue wool with a modest white collar, her hair pinned up plainly, her father's gloves, for I learned later they were his, tucked into her sleeve rather than worn, as though she could not bear to play in them, but could not bear to leave them behind either. The drawing-room by then was very full. 50 guests, as Mrs. Radcliffe had said, arranged themselves in a loose crescent before the great Steinway grand that stood gleaming black beneath the chandelier, its lacquer throwing back the candlelight of the tree in long amber streaks. I found a chair near the back, by the window, where I could see the whole room, the guests in their evening dress, diamonds catching the light, gentlemen with their thumbs in their waistcoat pockets, wearing the particular polite blankness of people bracing themselves to be disappointed graciously. Mrs. Radcliffe stood near the door with Mr. Halloway, her hands folded so tightly the knuckles had gone pale. And into all of that finery walked Prudence Oakley, small and plain and 22 years old, and sat down at the piano as the room's murmuring dimmed to silence around her. She did not begin at once. I want to record that, because I think it mattered more than anything else that happened that night. She sat for perhaps 3 full seconds with her hands resting on her knees, not the keys, and closed her eyes, and I saw her lips move, not in nervousness, I would swear to it even now, but in something closer to prayer, or to a private greeting, as though she were saying good evening to someone who was no longer in the room, but whose hands she still remembered inside her own. Then she laid her fingers on the keys and began. The first notes of "O Holy Night" came so softly that for a moment I feared the room had simply swallowed them, that this would be the very embarrassment Mrs. Radcliffe had dreaded, a girl too frightened to be heard. But it was not fear. It was intention. She was playing the opening as a whisper, because a whisper is what a silent night calls for, and by the third bar, every rustle of silk in that room had stilled, every cough swallowed, every gentleman's idle glance toward his neighbor, arrested and drawn instead toward the piano. Her hands were not the hands of a trained concert player, not polished by academies, or shaped by London masters, and I do not pretend they were flawless, but they were the hands of someone who had learned this music not from a page, but from a father's voice beside her, on a cold church bench. Someone for whom every phrase carried a second meaning beneath the first. When she reached the rising figure in the left hand beneath the melody, that low, patient climbing that seems to gather the whole song up from the earth, I saw an elderly lady in gray silk 2 rows in front of me, reach for her husband's hand without looking at him, the way people do when a feeling arrives before they have decided to permit it. The melody opened further, climbing toward its first great phrase, "Fall on your knees," though of course there were no words in the room that night, only the piano. But I dare say every soul present knew the words as well as I did, and heard them anyway, hanging invisible in the air above the black lacquer of that Steinway. Prudence's shoulders had lost their fear entirely now. She played with her whole upper body, leaning gently into the phrase, the candlelight from the tree catching the side of her face, catching the plain white collar of her dress, catching, too, the small chip of tortoiseshell comb in her hair that I would learn afterward had also been her father's, carried in her pocket every day since his passing, though she never dared wear it below stairs. Her foot found the pedal with a sureness that owed nothing to any dancing master, and everything to 100 childhood evenings spent watching a man's boot beneath an organ bench. By the second verse, she was no longer a linen maid borrowed for an emergency. She was simply the person in the room who understood, better than anyone gathered there in silk and diamonds, exactly what this music was for. The great phrase arrived, "O night divine," and here I confess an old soldier's eyes went unexpectedly wet, for she took the octave leap in the melody, not with the showy flourish a trained performer might have added for effect, but with a kind of aching restraint, as though she were holding something precious at arm's length, rather than throwing it wide, and the restraint made it larger, not smaller. A gentleman near the fireplace, a stout man I had marked earlier as the sort who complains loudly about soup temperature, had gone entirely still, his cigar forgotten and burning itself out unsmoked between his fingers. 2 of the younger ladies were openly crying, dabbing at their eyes with gloved fingers, and not troubling to hide it. The Christmas tree candles guttered faintly in some draught from the hall, and threw moving gold across the whole scene, across the piano, across Prudence's bent head, across 50 faces that had arrived in that room expecting nothing, and were receiving, instead, everything. She came to the final verse, the one that speaks of chains being broken, and a brother knowing his brother, and hear her playing quieted again, drawing the whole room forward in their seats to meet her, rather than pressing outward to fill the space. And I understood then what her father must have taught her on that Kentish organ bench years before, that the quietest moment in a piece of music, held with confidence, commands a room more completely than any thunder of chords ever could. Her hands slowed. The chandelier seemed to dim, though of course it had not. It was only that every eye in the room had narrowed to the single point of her fingers on the keys. The final chord came, not struck but settled into, as gently as snow settling on a windowsill, and she let it ring and ring and ring, her foot holding the pedal down, her head bowed, until the sound had thinned itself entirely into the hush of the room, and there was, for 3 full seconds, nothing at all, no cough, no rustle, no breath that I could hear. And then the room came apart. I have attended concert halls in London and Vienna in my younger days, gentlemen, and I tell you, I have never heard applause quite like what broke over that drawing room. 50 guests came to their feet as one body, and there was no polite scattering to it, no uncertain half-rising the way people do for an act they merely admire. They surged upward, all of them, gloved hands clapping, someone calling brava, an elderly gentleman near the door actually pounding his walking stick against the floor in time. The stout man by the fireplace had found his voice again and was bellowing, "Encore, encore," loud enough to rattle the tree ornaments. I stood myself, on my bad knee, and did not care. Prudence sat very still at the bench through all of it, her hands folded now in her lap, her face turned slightly down, and I could see even from across the room that she was trembling. Not with fear this time, I think, but with the particular shaking that comes when a great weight, carried alone for a very long while, is finally set down. It was Mrs. Radcliffe who moved first. She crossed the drawing-room floor in front of 50 guests, in front of the manager, in front of the whole glittering assembly she had spent her career protecting from exactly this sort of surprise. and she did not wait for the applause to die. She came to stand beside the piano bench, and I watched her face very closely, because I wanted to know, and I think every soul in that room wanted to know, whether pride would win out over what had just happened, the way pride so often does in people who have built their whole lives on order and correctness. It did not win. "Miss Oakley," Mrs. Radcliffe said, and her voice, usually so crisp and commanding, had gone unsteady. "I owe you an apology, and I mean to give it properly, in front of everyone I gave that warning to. I told you that you would shame this house. I was wrong, and I was wrong in a manner I do not think I have ever been so entirely wrong before. You have not shamed the Aldwyn Grand tonight. You have given it the finest Christmas Eve I have witnessed in 30 years below stairs." She paused, and I saw her throat work once before she went on. "Your father would be very proud of you. I am sorry it took me so long, and so public a moment, to say what should have been plain to me from the first, that a gift like yours does not care what apron it comes wrapped in." Prudence looked up at her, and there were tears standing in her eyes now too, though her voice held steady. "Thank you, Mrs. Radcliffe." He always told me the music didn't know who was playing it, only that someone was. Mr. Halloway, who had been standing near the door looking for all the world like a man who has just watched his hotel's fortunes turn a corner he never expected, stepped forward then, beaming, and clasped his hands together before the assembled guests. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think you will agree the Aldwyn Grand has this evening discovered a resident musician. It very nearly overlooked entirely. Miss Oakley, it would be my very great honor, if you are willing, to release you from your linen duties and appoint you house pianist for the season, and I hope, for many seasons to come." The room broke into fresh applause at that, warmer even than the first, and I saw the stout man by the fireplace, cigar quite forgotten now on the mantel, nodding so vigorously his collar had come loose. Prudence rose from the bench at last, and dropped a curtsy that had nothing servile in it at all, only grace, and when she lifted her eyes again, there was a brightness in them that no chandelier had put there. We went into midnight mass not long after, the whole party of us, guests and staff, mingling in a manner the Aldwyn Grand had certainly never seen before, or, I suspect, has quite managed since, and I noticed that not a single chair in that small chapel was filled when the bells began, for every soul in the house had crowded instead into the standing space at the back, unwilling to sit while Prudence Oakley walked past them to take her place once more at a keyboard, this time the chapel's own modest instrument, and lift the same carol into the frosted midnight air. I have wintered 11 years at the Aldwyn Grand, and I expect, God willing, to winter a few more, and I will tell you plainly that of everything I have seen pass through those doors, royalty, scandal, weather fit to end the world, nothing has stayed with me the way that Christmas Eve did. A linen maid, a dare meant kindly but expecting failure, and a room full of strangers who stood up together in the candlelight because a girl of 22 had finally been allowed to play what her father left inside her hands,